So before we part, just wanted to make everyone aware of what's happening in Hitler's birthplace of Austria. In Austria, the Austrian Secret Service, state security, is targeting a journalist who's a friend of this show, Richard Medhurst, who we've had on to discuss being raided by the British counterterror police. Here's Richard Medhurst. I was detained this week by the Austrian police and intelligence services. They raided my house, office, and took all my devices. They're accusing me of being a member of Hamas and threatened me with 10 years in prison. Journalism is not a crime. We'll listen to like a portion of Richard's message.
My name is Richard Medhurst. I'm an internationally accredited journalist from the UK. On Monday, agents from the Austrian police and intelligence services detained me, raided my home, raided my studio, and then interrogated me. They essentially lured me into a trap. So I received a letter from the government last week from immigration, summoning me for some interview at my residency. I found that a bit odd because I've lived here for a while. I never had any problems. So having nothing to fear, I went to the meeting by myself. And then after a few simple questions, they suddenly issued a thinly veiled threat saying they were considering revoking my residency because of my alleged reporting on Palestine and Lebanon. So of course, my answer was no comment. And as soon as I thought everything was over, I was ambushed by a group of plainclothes agents. They entered the room, flashing their badges in my face, and they said that they were the Austrian equivalent of MI5 or the FBI. They detained me, and then they served me with a warrant from the state prosecutor to search my home, search my studio, take all of my devices. Why? Because they think that I, a Christian Englishman, am a member of Hamas. Yes, you heard that correctly. They are accusing me of being a member of Hamas, of being part of the Izz al-Din Qassam brigades, of disseminating propaganda, encouraging terrorism, being affiliated with organized crime and a terrorist group. I mean, it's like reading something out of the Twilight Zone. So they seized my phone and they drove me to my residence, ransacked the place. They even took devices which I repeatedly told them do not belong to me. Then they drove me to my studio and turned the place upside down. So I had to watch my devices being disassembled before my very eyes by a group of strangers. All these tools that I spent years building and investing in, the core of my journalistic profession. They took, in total, they took like 5-6 different laptops and computers, phones, USB sticks, hard drives, DVDs, you name it. And although the warrant was for electronic devices only, for some reason, they took photos of my residence, photos of the office, of the bathroom. They helped themselves to anything they saw, books, papers, documents, cupboards, closets. To tell you the truth, though, the agents treated me kindly and with respect. They didn't deny me any of my basic needs. Now, as you recall, I was unjustly arrested a few months ago in London. They jailed me for almost 24 hours under the Terrorism Act. Strangely enough, last week, the police in England again extended this investigation. And then suddenly this happens in Vienna. I don't think that is mere coincidence, okay? The first thing I asked the Austrian agents was, did my government put you up to this? And they replied, no, Britain doesn't talk to us. Well, forgive me, but I find that a bit hard to believe. I do think that this persecution, this raid, is related to the case in Britain. I think it's being coordinated with Britain. Now, my colleague, Stefania Marizzi, who works on the Snowden papers with Glenn Greenwald, she reported last month in Il Fatto Quotidiano that the British police seized a graphene OS device from me and that it was very unlikely that they'd be able to crack it. So I suppose that's why Britain asked the Austrians to raid me, grab anything they could find, and go on this massive fishing expedition. The warrant even mentions my arrest in London to try and bolster their case. The Austrian agents, they asked me for the passwords to my devices, and I said no, because as a journalist, I have an ethical, a professional obligation to protect my sources. None of them were compromised. During the raid, I spoke briefly with the techs who were extracting my devices, from one nerd to another. And they told me that if they can't crack the devices, they send them outside sometimes to other countries, to other law enforcement agencies, and ask them for help. So that further indicated to me that this could very well be related to what's happening in the UK against me. Now,
that's what's happening across Western Europe now. Richard is not the only one. There are too many to name who have been raided, who have been faced state repression for their views on Palestine, for their stated views on Palestine, for speaking positively of the resistance, for example. 12 days before Richard was raided, Ali Abu Nima, the founder of Electronic Intifada, one of the first online Palestine solidarity-oriented journalistic newsletters in the US, was arrested violently on the streets of Zurich under the orders of the local interior minister, who himself, as we discussed before, was a pro-Israel zealot. And Ali was just simply going to give a talk to the local Palestine committee about Gaza. And he was treated as some kind of terrorist and deported, investigated for terrorism. Britain has passed this new terrorism act. You're not allowed to praise Hamas or Hezbollah. And that appears to be what Richard is being prosecuted or investigated for in the UK. And now the investigation has crossed borders into Austria. This is targeting journalists for their views. And as Igor Bohm, who is an Austrian citizen, pointed out, Austria's government has elevated Hamas to the same level as the Nazis by further tightening its National Prohibition Act, originally aimed at denazification of Austria by punishing any trivialization or relativization of the Nazi Holocaust or other Nazi crimes against humanity. Anyone who publicly wears Nazi badges or Hamas symbols in the future could be punished equally severely. Legislation of this ilk is instilled as a backup in case the power to rationalize Israel's mass murder campaign fails to fulfill its primary function to keep the public minds from being cluttered with inconvenient facts. That's a pretty good analysis of some highly authoritarian pro-Israel laws that have been passed in Austria, which now equate resistance to Israel with Nazism and criminalize anyone who opposes Israel, which really brings home the point that Israel is one of Israel and the Israel lobby, the Zionist movement that is pushing for these laws, poses an existential threat to freedoms that have been taken for granted in the West, particularly in the United States. They pose the most direct threat to the First Amendment. And we're going to see more and more attacks on it in the United States from the Republican Congress, and even possibly from the Trump Justice Department, which has been supported and cheered on by so many fake free speech warriors. But it's important to send your support to Richard Medhurst. He's being hounded all around the so-called Garden of Europe for his journalism, for his words, for his opinions. The mask of liberal democracy is off. And those of you who participate in Palestine solidarity activities, who have organized against the genocide, the Holocaust of our time in Gaza, be careful when you go to Western Europe. Richard installed Graphene OS on his phone to prevent the British police from hacking into his phone, and it succeeded in preventing them from hacking into his phone. And that's why they're hounding him, because he won't let them into his devices, but they will hack into your devices. They're summoning virtually every activist I know there in the UK for some kind of police interview now. They're freaking out, and they're throwing away their values that they have professed since World War II, their values of liberal democracy, for a psychotic little apartheid state called Israel. That's what they're willing to do, to shut us up.